Hi, my name is Lawrence Price, and I'm here with Discipleship Ministries, and I'm excited today because this will be our first um, discussion or talk in a series of discussions around the book of Esther. And I'm really excited about talking about sharing book today and just over the next several pieces, just going through this story and going through this very important book in the Old Testament. Today, I'd like to really center the conversation around Esther chapter 3, and I'll be reading verses 14 and 15. But I'm going to talk about, the first three chapters pretty much as a whole, and then do kind of finish up with verses 14 and 15 here in chapter 3. So in the King James, it says, "The copy of the writing for a commandment to be given in every province was published unto all people, that they should be ready against that day. The post went out, being hastened by the king's commandment, and the decree was given in Shushan the palace. And the king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Shushan was perplexed." So here, what we find here specifically in chapter 3, verses 14 and 15, is this decree that Haman, who is a member of the royal court, he's not the king, but he is a man that's been empowered by the king to make this particular law. And he sends out a decree that in just under a year, that every Jewish person within the entire kingdom of Persia would be executed. And so there's a lot of things to kind of walk through here, but the main topic that I want to kind of focus in on or focus our conversation on is that the enemy's plan is already undone. That Haman, in his haste to create this law and to really be in a situation to where he can execute the people that he sees as his enemy, and he's relaxing there with the king, drinking wine, and he thinks that he's won. He doesn't realize, doesn't know that God had already set things in motions years prior in order to make sure that he doesn't have victory there. The first three chapters of Esther covered more than 10 years. When you read through it, you don't really kind of get a sense of the timing, but if it covers about a 10-year period, and during that time period, we see a lot of events where God is orchestrating and moving people and situations and places and roles that they will be able to influence the outcome of this overall story. The author of the book, we think it might be Esther's cousin Mordecai, but it's not necessarily very clear exactly who's writing it. But the accounts take place in ancient Persia. And it's really important that we kind of keep that in mind because it influences some of the things that we'll see, especially in these opening chapters. As we think about the height of the Persian Empire, it's massive. At one point, it probably numbered about 127 different countries. Its population ranged somewhere between 17 and 35 million. It had absorbed the Babylonian Empire, and if you're familiar with Jewish history, the Babylonians had conquered Israel, they had conquered the Jews, and so when the Persians absorbed the Babylonian Empire, the Jewish population that was a part of the Babylonian Empire was also absorbed. So it's estimated during the time of Esther's, this story about the book of Esther, we're thinking somewhere between 40 and 200,000 people Jewish people were actually in the empire at this point. So just imagine being one of those thousands of Jewish people living in the Persian Empire, and out of the blue, out of nowhere, you're just going about your day, raising your family, doing the work, doing the things that you do. You see this decree that says that in less than a year, you and all of your loved ones are going to be executed by the state. Things like that can happen where you're not persecuted or go through trials because of something that you've done or something that you failed to do. It's not because you did something wrong or you did something right. You're being persecuted because of who you are. And those things are something that I think all of us have experienced at some point in our lives. And that is something that these Jewish people throughout the entire Persian Empire are experiencing when this decree is sent out, that they had not created a personal offense against the king of Persia or Haman himself, but yet they were going to be on the receiving end of this wrath. There's an illustration I like to just lift from my own kind of personal life story that kind of talks a little bit about just what it means to be persecuted, not because of anything that you've done, but because of who you are or what group of people that you belong to. When I was in high school, I was starting, I think it was my sophomore year in high school. I remember the first day of class, I walked into, I was an honors student, and I walked into my geometry honors class. And I remember the teacher, like, most teachers or all teachers do on the first day of class, she's taking attendance. And when she looks up and she sees me, she drops her book, she drops her hands, and I'm literally the in the desk is furthest away from her. I'm in the back corner of the classroom, and she walks by all the other students to come to my desk, and even without just saying hello and introducing herself or asking me my name, um, she asked to see my class schedule. And she sees my class schedule and she goes, "You do realize this is geometry honors?" And I said, "Yes, ma'am." And she's like, "Well, just know that you won't receive any special treatment from me. I won't be slowing my class down for you. That you can absolutely not expect any support from me." It was one of those moments where I just kind of froze, and I just said, "Yes, ma'am." Her prejudice against me in that classroom that day had nothing to do with my behavior, had nothing to do with anything I'd done. She had made a determination about how she was going to treat me simply because of who I was and the group of people that I belonged to, that she attributed me to. As Christians, the world and the enemy in the world doesn't attack us because of the color of our skin or our gender or anything like that. He attacks us because we're born again. And we have to remember that there are going to be trials. There are trials certainly that happen because we did the wrong thing. There's going to be trials because we did the right thing. And then there's trials like the ones that we're going to be talking about here in the book of Esther that have nothing to do with anything that you've done. They have everything to do with who you are and whose you are. And I want us to kind of keep that in mind as we're going through this, and remember the important aspect, especially today's topic, is that even though the enemy is looking to undermine us and attack us, God has already set in motion the things that would guarantee our success and our victory. So let's turn our attention to kind of like the very opening chapter in Esther. There's a situation where the initial queen of Persia, Queen Vashti, is put in a no-win situation. Chapter 1, verse 12 says, "But the Queen Vashti refused to come at the king's commandment by his chamberlains. Therefore was the king very wroth, and his anger burned in him." So the situation here is that the king had been celebrating for 180 days, 6 months. He had a 6-month long party where he had all the princes and things like that. And they had gotten to a point where they had really celebrated. And then they had like an extra 7 days where they partied even harder. And at the same time, the Queen Vashti, she was having her own separate feast with the wives. An important part here is that because the wives are with the queen, that means that the audience, the people that are kind of partying and celebrating with the king, are all men. And so there's a point where the king and all the princes are extremely drunk, and they request, or the king demands, that Queen Vashti comes and presents herself not just to him, but to the entire room. And so you have to remember, kind of understand that in Persian culture, women didn't unveil themselves in public. And so for her to kind of show up in this unveiled situation or an unveiled setting, especially in public, not just with the king in private, but openly with all these men, it would be a disgrace to her. It would be a shame to her. It would be something that would just be a traumatic experience for her. On the other hand, if she refused the king, she would be refusing a direct commandment from him, and she would also kind of be put in peril as well for that. So she decided to, she's certainly in a no-win situation, so she decided to turn down the king's request or demand to show herself. And so, of course, the king became extremely angry that the Queen Vashti refused him in this way. And so he went through the process of divorcing her. Now, in Persian law, The only thing that the king can't do is undo a commandment that he had already set in motion. So when he makes this decision to basically put her away, to set her aside, to divorce her, this is not something that he can undo, which brings us basically to chapter 2. By the time that the king is about 4 years later, he's in a situation to where he actually kind of regrets his decision and he misses the previous queen. However, he cannot undo the decision that he had already made. And so essentially what his counselors offered to him or suggested to him is, I'm going to describe it as basically a nationwide beauty pageant. And so this is where we start to kind of pull Esther into this entire narrative. So Esther was a child of the Babylonian captivity. She was an orphan. So she was motherless, she was fatherless, and she had been adopted presumably by an older cousin, Mordecai, who has basically been the one that had raised her. So as the chapter 2 explains what this process looks like, it's about a 12 months journey that all these women have to go through in order to be considered as a potential queen for the king. Esther goes through this entire 12-month process. The people that are facilitating the process begin to show her some favor. At the end of the 12-month journey, what would happen is that these women would be presented to the king. They would spend the night with him. And then at the end of it, they would be able to pick any gift that they want, and then they would be added to the harem. And the only way that they would ever get a chance to see the king again was if he recalled them by name. And so none of the women that had gone before Esther had been recalled back by the king. And so when it came to Esther's turn, one of the officials that are facilitating this process suggested to her and said, "Hey, look, all the other women are picking these really lavish gifts after the meeting with the king. Pick something humble." And so that's what she does. She takes that person's advice, and when she has given the opportunity to pick a gift out for herself after meeting the king, she does pick something humble, and this allowed her to stand out. And then she was able to get favor with the king. And this is how Esther became queen. At the same time, as we kind of get into a little bit more of the story about Haman and Mordecai at this point, Haman is this person that is in the king's court, and he's also gaining favor with the king. Now, Haman was a member of the people called the Agagites. Excuse me if I get that wrong, that pronunciation wrong, but the Agagites had been an enemy of the Jewish people since the time of Moses. So this is an ancient bitterness and tension between the Agagites and the Jews. Now, when Esther started going through this 12-month process, her cousin Mordecai cautioned her and said, "Hey, don't let anyone know that you're Jewish. Keep that part of your identity secret." And so at this point, Esther had not disclosed to the king or anyone that she was Jewish. Because of Haman's assent, because of the power that he was granted, the king made a determination that anyone that when they see Haman, that they're supposed to bow before him. Now, when Haman shows up and he's walking by and Mordecai is in his presence, Mordecai refuses to bow. So we don't know if Mordecai did this because of the animosity between the Jewish and the Agagite people, or because of his faith, he just didn't believe in bowing down to any man. Nevertheless, he did not bow, and the word got back to Haman that Mordecai had refused to bow, and that the reason for this was that Mordecai was a Jewish person. And so as a result of that, Haman gets in wrath. He gets angry. He's furious that Mordecai had the audacity to not bow to him. And so as opposed to taking his animosity out on taking his animosity out on Mordecai alone, he made a decision to go after the entire Jewish people. And this is how he approached the king in order to make sure that he had the authority to kill every Jewish person in the Persian kingdom. So, can you imagine being one of those 40 to 200,000 Jewish people living in Persia at this time, and you received this decree that in less than a year that you and all your loved ones are going to be executed? How would you have felt? How would you have experienced that moment that your demise was being predicted and being laid out before you? But at the same time as they were getting this decree, they didn't realize that for the past 10 years, that God had been setting in motion things that would lead to their eventual deliverance. They didn't know that how God was using the situation where Queen Vashti had been removed from her post, and that Esther had been put in this place of influence to replace her. They didn't know about all the things that Esther went through in that 1 year journey, and just the favor and things like that she was racking up. They didn't know about the familiar relationship between Mordecai and now the new queen, and how he would be able to influence her and coach her and really remind her of her faith and strengthen her and encourage her during this whole time. In a situation where the enemy thinks that he already has the victory, Haman is now lounging in the palace with the king, drinking wine, thinking that he had already won. The people didn't realize that God had already set in motion the opportunity for their deliverance. When I think back to that classroom in geometry, I had this teacher who thought that she had really kind of set me in my place. She didn't know that God had already orchestrated things for me to be delivered and see my way through that. She didn't realize that even though that was a geometry honors class, that was actually the easiest class that was on my schedule that year. She didn't realize that I just happened to be sitting around some of my closest friends in the school, even though they were people that didn't look like me. She didn't know that I had so much favor with some of my other teachers that if I did have a problem with her class, that they would be more than happy to tutor me and help me to work through it. And definitely didn't realize that I was going to get an A in her class without ever talking to her the entire year. There's enemies, of course. There's an enemy that's after every Christian because of the fact that we're born again, because that we're born again believers, that is attacking us. And if he had any clue, if he knew anything about anything, he would realize that God had already set aside and created our escape, our deliverance 2,000 years ago. And so no matter what you're going through today, no matter what challenge you're facing, no matter what unexpected news that you're going through, rest assured that your deliverance has already been set in motion, that God is already working through it. And even though you might have been surprised about what happens, God wasn't. God had already seen it. God was already made preparations for your escape and for your deliverance. So the enemy has a plan, but I want you to know it's already undone, that you've already have the victory in it, even when you don't see how the victory is going to come about. May God bless you and may God keep you. Thank you.